April 14th was supposed to be a day of relaxation, but the moment I stepped out of my car and into the quiet forest surrounding the cabin, I felt a chill run down my spine. The cabin, hidden deep in the woods, was exactly as the pictures had shown. Quaint, rustic, and completely isolated. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the only sounds were the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. As I approached the front door, my eyes were drawn to strange carvings etched into the wooden frame. They looked ancient, almost tribal, but I shrugged it off as local folklore. Inside, the cabin was cozy, but felt eerily quiet. The furniture was old but well kept, and a fire had already been laid out in the hearth, ready to be lit. As I wandered through the small rooms, the sense of unease grew. It wasn't just the isolation. It was the feeling that the cabin held secrets. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the silence was heavy, almost suffocating. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was just the unfamiliar surroundings playing tricks on my mind. As evening fell, the light outside dimmed, casting long shadows across the cabin's interior. I made myself a cup of tea and settled down in front of the fire, trying to relax. But as the night grew darker, the sounds of the forest seemed to grow louder. The rustling of leaves became more insistent, and I could have sworn I heard faint whispers carried on the wind. I tried to ignore it, but the whispers persisted, growing clearer and more distinct. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I realized the whispers were coming from just outside the cabin. My heart began to race, and I stood up, peering out the window into the pitch-black night. There was nothing there, just the dark outline of trees against the night sky. But the whispers continued, soft and insistent, as if something or someone was just outside, waiting. I backed away from the window, my pulse quickening as the whispers grew louder, more urgent. It was then that I realized something was terribly wrong. The whispers weren't just random noises. They were voices, speaking a language I couldn't understand. Panic started to set in, and I knew I couldn't stay inside the cabin any longer. But as I reached for the door, a cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing the fire and plunging the cabin into darkness. My hand trembled as I fumbled for the flashlight in my bag, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be lurking outside. The whispers were now a constant murmur, almost like a chant, surrounding the cabin on all sides. When I finally found the flashlight, its weak beam barely cut through the oppressive darkness that had filled the room. The carvings on the walls seemed to writhe in the dim light, as if alive, and I could no longer dismiss them as mere decoration. Something was watching me, something ancient and malevolent. Determined to find the source of the whispers, I made my way cautiously to the basement door. It was old and wooden, with rusted hinges that groaned as I slowly pushed it open. A gust of cold air greeted me, carrying with it the musty scent of decay. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, shining the flashlight down into the pitch-black void below. The beam revealed narrow steps leading into darkness, but nothing else. Taking a deep breath, I descended, the whispers growing louder with each step. The basement was colder than the rest of the cabin, and the air was thick with a damp, earthy smell. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the stone walls as I reached the bottom. The room was small and cluttered with old, forgotten items, rusty tools, broken furniture, and cobweb-covered boxes. But what caught my attention was a door, half hidden behind a pile of debris. It was locked, the heavy padlock covered in dust and rust. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized this must be where the whispers were coming from. I searched the basement for something to break the lock, my fear mounting with every passing second. Finally, I found an old crowbar and began prying at the padlock, the metal groaning under the pressure. The whispers grew more frantic, as if whatever was behind the door knew I was getting closer. With one final push, the lock snapped and the door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside, the walls were covered in symbols similar to the ones upstairs, but these were freshly painted, the red ink still wet and glistening. In the center of the room was an old wooden table, and on it lay an open journal. The pages were yellowed with age, and the handwriting was barely legible, but it told a chilling story. The journal belonged to someone who had stayed in the cabin long before me. They wrote of strange occurrences, of whispers in the night, and of a presence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The entries became more frantic, more desperate, until they abruptly stopped, mid-sentence. The last page was stained with something dark, and the final words sent a shiver down my spine. It won't let me leave. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was not the first to experience this terror, and I wouldn't be the last. My mind raced with the implications of what I had just read, and a cold dread settled in my stomach. I had to get out of the cabin, but as I turned to leave, a sudden loud bang echoed through the basement, shaking the walls. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as the sound of footsteps slowly descended the stairs behind me. The sound of footsteps descending the stairs was deliberate and slow, each step sending a jolt of terror through my body. My mind raced as I tried to think of what to do next. I was trapped in the basement with no escape route, and whatever was coming down those stairs was getting closer by the second. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I pointed it toward the doorway, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist, distorting the small space into something nightmarish. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence filled the basement, thick and heavy, as if the air itself had frozen in time. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just an overwhelming sense of dread. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to move, had to get out of the cabin. Slowly, I backed away from the door, keeping the flashlight trained on it, my pulse racing as I reached the stairs. As I turned to climb back up, the basement door suddenly slammed shut, the noise reverberating through the room like a thunderclap. I jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight as the walls seemed to close in around me. The air grew colder, and I could feel a presence behind me, so close it felt like icy breath on the back of my neck. Panic gripped me as I turned, expecting to see something horrifying, but there was nothing. Just the darkness and the shadows playing tricks on my mind. Desperation fueled my actions as I scrambled up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the confined space. I reached the top and tried the door, but it wouldn't budge, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. My heart pounded as I threw my weight against it, again and again, but it remained stubbornly closed. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before, filling my ears with unintelligible words that seemed to burrow into my mind. Suddenly, the basement light flickered on, casting an eerie glow over the room. I turned back, my eyes drawn to the center of the room, where the symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The journal on the table flipped open, the pages turning rapidly as if an unseen hand was rifling through them. The final page landed on a new message, written in the same dark substance as before. "You can't leave." My stomach twisted in fear, and a cold sweat broke out of my skin as I realized the cabin wasn't going to let me go easily. With renewed determination, I turned back to the door, throwing my body against it one last time. This time, it flew open with a deafening crash, and I stumbled into the cabin's main room, gasping for breath. The oppressive atmosphere followed me, the whispers still echoing in my ears as objects in the room began to move on their own. Chairs scraping across the floor, the curtains billowing as if caught in a gust of wind. Shadows darted along the walls, forming shapes that seemed almost human, but twisted and distorted. I knew I had to leave the cabin, but as I rushed to the front door, my heart sank. I could see my car parked outside, but something in the back of my mind told me it wouldn't be that simple. My hand shook as I reached for the door handle, and as soon as I touched it, a loud crash came from behind me, as if the entire cabin had shifted. I whipped around, expecting the worst, and found myself staring at the basement door, now wide open and shrouded in darkness. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was in the basement was trying to draw me back. The urge to run was overwhelming, but deep down, I knew the cabin wasn't done with me yet. I stood frozen in place, torn between the instinct to flee and the unsettling pull of the basement. The whispers had grown louder, filling the cabin with a chaotic chorus that seemed to seep into my very thoughts. My grip tightened on the flashlight as I forced myself to take a step forward, away from the open basement door. But as I moved, the front door suddenly slammed shut with a force that shook the walls, trapping me inside once more. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the air thick with a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. Desperation clawed at me as I tried to pry the front door open, but it wouldn't budge, as if something was holding it closed from the outside. The windows rattled in their frames, and the shadows on the walls began to swirl, forming shapes that seemed almost human, but not quite. The whispers became screams, piercing and relentless, driving needles of fear into my mind. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest, as I realized that there was no way out. The cabin had me, and it wasn't going to let me leave. In a panic, I turned and ran for the back of the cabin, where I remembered seeing a small, hidden passage earlier. The passage was narrow and dark, almost completely concealed behind an old bookshelf. I shoved the furniture aside, revealing the small door that led to the passage. It was barely large enough for me to squeeze through, but I didn't care. I had to get out, no matter what. My hands trembled as I pulled the door open and I crawled into the narrow tunnel, the walls pressing in on me from all sides. The passage was damp and cold, the air filled with the scent of mold and decay. I could barely move, forced to inch forward on my hands and knees, the flashlight's beam flickering weakly ahead of me. The whispers faded behind me, replaced by the sound of my own labored breathing and the pounding of my heart. I crawled for what felt like hours, the passage winding and twisting, until I finally saw a faint light ahead. Relief surged through me as I realized I was nearing the exit, but the feeling was short-lived. As I approached the light, the passage suddenly opened up into a small underground chamber. The light was coming from a hole in the ceiling, where I could see the stars twinkling faintly above. But before I could climb out, I felt a cold, clammy hand grip my ankle, yanking me back into the darkness. I screamed, kicking frantically to free myself, but the grip only tightened. The whispers returned, louder and more terrifying than before, as the unseen force began to drag me back into the passage. My flashlight fell from my grasp, its light flickering out, plunging me into darkness as I was pulled deeper into the unknown. Darkness engulfed me as I was dragged backward, the cold grip on my ankle relentless and unyielding. My heart pounded in my chest, the terror almost paralyzing as I clawed at the walls of the narrow passage, desperately trying to find something to hold on to. The whispers became deafening, filling my mind with a cacophony of voices, each one more frantic and malevolent than the last. I could feel the presence behind me, cold and oppressive, as if the very air around me was being sucked away. My vision blurred as panic took hold, and I knew I had to fight with every ounce of strength I had left. With a surge of adrenaline, I twisted and kicked, managing to free myself from the icy grip that had been dragging me into the depths of the passage. I scrambled forward, my hands and knees scraping against the rough stone floor as I pushed myself toward the faint light ahead. The whispers grew more distant, but the sense of urgency remained, driving me to move faster. I could feel the presence receding, but I knew it wasn't gone. It was simply waiting, biding its time. The passage narrowed once more, forcing me to crawl on my belly as I inched closer to the exit. Finally, I reached the small hole in the ceiling, the cool, night air rushing in and filling my lungs. With trembling hands, I pulled myself up, emerging into the forest just as dawn began to break on the horizon. The sky was tinged with shades of pink and orange, a stark contrast to the darkness I had just escaped. I collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The cabin was behind me now, hidden among the trees, but the memories of what I had experienced lingered, etched into my mind like a scar. As I lay there, staring up at the sky, I heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching through the underbrush. My heart leaped into my throat as I struggled to sit up, fearing the worst. But as the figure emerged from the trees, I realized it was a park ranger, his expression one of concern and confusion. He helped me to my feet, asking what had happened, but I could barely form the words. I mumbled something about the cabin, the whispers, and the basement, but he simply shook his head, chalking it up to an overactive imagination and the isolation of the woods. Together, we walked back to his station, the cabin now just a distant memory as the sun continued to rise. The ranger offered me a ride back to civilization, and as we drove away, I glanced back at the forest one last time. The cabin was hidden deep within, its secrets buried along with the terrifying experiences I had endured. I knew I was safe now, far from the reach of whatever haunted those woods. But as we rounded a bend in the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin was still watching. March 6, 2018, marked the beginning of what was supposed to be a peaceful retreat at a remote Airbnb by March Lake. The moment I arrived, the desolation of the place struck me. The lake was eerily still, its surface like glass reflecting the overcast sky. The surrounding woods were thick, almost impenetrable, their silence oppressive. The cabin itself was small and quaint, but something about its location, nestled right against the lake's edge, felt unsettling. As I unloaded my bags, I noticed how the air seemed heavier here, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. The first evening passed in quiet solitude, but as darkness fell, the atmosphere around the lake grew even more unnerving. A dense fog rolled in, shrouding the water in a thick, ghostly mist. The trees seemed to close in around the cabin, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I stood on the porch, staring out at the lake, when I noticed something unusual. A small, abandoned boat, half submerged near the shore. It looked old, weather-beaten, as if it hadn't been used in years. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to inspect it closer in the morning. The next day, I made my way down to the lake, the fog still lingering over the water, giving the entire area an ethereal, almost dreamlike quality. The boat was more deteriorated up close, its wood rotting and covered in moss. As I stood there, a sense of unease crept over me. The lake was too quiet, too still, as if it were hiding something just beneath the surface. Ignoring the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach, I climbed into the boat, grabbing the old oars that lay beside it. The idea of exploring the lake's center appealed to me, despite the nagging voice in my head telling me to turn back. As I rowed out onto the lake, the mist thickened, swallowing the shore behind me. The further I went, the more disoriented I became, the landmarks fading into the white void. The water beneath the boat was unnaturally calm, almost as if it were frozen. But then, out of nowhere, I felt a faint ripple beneath the boat, as if something large had just passed underneath. I paused, holding my breath, but the water remained still. Shaking off the feeling, I continued to row, but a chill had settled into my bones, one that no amount of effort could shake. As I reached what I assumed was the center of the lake, the boat abruptly stopped, as if it had hit something solid. I leaned over the edge, peering into the murky water, but it was impossible to see anything beneath the surface. The silence around me was absolute, broken only by the soft lapping of water against the boat. I couldn't explain it, but the air felt different here. Heavier, charged with something I couldn't quite define. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard it. A faint, ghostly whisper carried on the wind, sending a shiver down my spine. The lake, it seemed, was not as empty as it appeared. The whisper echoed in my ears, faint but unmistakable, as if it was carried on the wind from some distant place. My heart raced as I strained to hear more, but the lake remained unnervingly silent. The boat rocked gently beneath me, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The mist around me grew denser, swallowing the world in a thick, impenetrable white. The shore was no longer visible, and a deep sense of isolation settled over me. I wasn't alone out here. Something was watching, waiting beneath the calm surface. I gripped the oars tightly, my knuckles white as I tried to push the boat forward, but it refused to move. It was as if something beneath the water was holding it in place, anchoring me to the spot. Panic began to set in as I realized how far I had drifted from the shore. The whisper came again, this time clearer, closer, sending a chill down my spine. It was not just a sound. It felt like a presence, something ancient and malevolent lurking just out of sight. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively looked over the edge of the boat, half expecting to see something staring back. The water remained still, its surface unbroken, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I leaned back, trying to calm my racing thoughts, but the sense of dread only intensified. The mist seemed to close in tighter, suffocating in its density. The whispering grew louder, no longer just a single voice, but a chorus, murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. It filled my mind, blocking out everything else until it was all I could hear. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the voices persisted, relentless, as if they were inside my head. Desperation clawed at me as I tried once again to row back to shore, but the boat remained stubbornly still. My movements became frantic, the oars splashing uselessly against the water. The whispers seemed to mock my efforts, growing louder and more insistent. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, the air around me thick with an unnatural chill. Just as I was about to abandon the oars and dive into the water, the boat lurched violently, nearly throwing me overboard. I clung to the sides, heart pounding as the water beneath the boat began to churn. The calm surface of the lake was suddenly disturbed, ripples spreading out from beneath the boat as if something massive was moving below. My pulse quickened, fear gripping me as I realized I was no longer in control. The boat began to drift again, but not back toward the shore. Instead, it was being pulled deeper into the lake. The whispers reached a fever pitch, the voices overlapping, creating a cacophony that threatened to overwhelm me. I knew I had to do something, anything, to break free from whatever force had taken hold of me. But before I could act, the boat came to a sudden stop, the water beneath it unnaturally still once more. I sat frozen in the boat, the unnatural stillness of the lake around me amplifying the pounding of my heart. The whispers had faded into an eerie silence, but the sense of dread remained, wrapping around me like a cold shroud. I knew I had to get out of the boat and make it back to shore, but the thought of diving into the dark water sent a wave of fear through me. The light from the mist was dim, barely illuminating the surface, and I had no idea what might be lurking beneath. Gathering my courage, I stood up, careful not to tip the boat. As I peered over the edge, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The water directly beneath the boat was darker, almost black, as if it were hiding something deep below. My hands trembled as I considered my options, but the silence was suffocating, pushing me to make a decision. I knew I couldn't stay here. Whatever had stopped the boat wasn't going to let me leave easily. Taking a deep breath, I prepared to dive in. Just as I was about to jump, I felt a cold, slimy hand grip my ankle, yanking me back into the boat. I screamed, kicking frantically, but the hand's grip tightened, pulling me closer to the edge. I could feel my heart racing, the fear overwhelming as I struggled to break free. The boat rocked violently, and I could see the water churning beneath me, as if something massive was rising from the depths. Desperation took hold as I kicked harder, finally breaking free from the icy grasp. I scrambled to the other side of the boat, panting and shaking, my mind racing with terror. The water stilled once more, but I knew better than to believe it was over. The boat began to drift again, but this time it was moving faster, as if being pushed by an unseen force. I clung to the sides, trying to keep my balance. As the mist thickened around me, the whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. I could hear them all around me, pressing in on my thoughts, making it hard to focus. The boat continued its eerie journey, and I realized with growing horror that I was being taken deeper into the lake, far from any chance of escape. As the whispers reached a crescendo, the boat suddenly lurched to a stop, nearly throwing me overboard. I looked around, trying to see through the thick mist, but all I could see was the endless expanse of water. The whispers ceased abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the boat had come to a stop in the exact center of the lake. The air was heavy with anticipation, as if the lake itself was waiting for something to happen. I knew then that whatever force had brought me here was far from finished, and I was at its mercy. The boat remained motionless, the silence around me so complete it felt like a physical weight. The mist clung to the surface of the water, shrouding everything in an eerie, white fog. My heart pounded in my chest, every breath shallow and quick. I scanned the water, searching for any sign of movement, but the lake was unnervingly still. The oppressive quiet only intensified the fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. I gripped the edges of the boat, my knuckles white, trying to steady my trembling hands. The whispers had stopped, but the sense of being watched persisted. It was as if the lake itself was alive, its dark depths concealing something ancient and malevolent. I knew I had to get out of the water, but the thought of diving into that inky blackness filled me with dread. The boat seemed to be holding me captive, and I felt a growing sense of desperation. A faint ripple disturbed the surface of the water, sending a shiver down my spine. I leaned over the side of the boat, straining to see what had caused it, but the water revealed nothing. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be lurking beneath me, hidden in the darkness. The boat suddenly shifted, tilting slightly as if something was brushing against its underside. I pulled back, fear gripping my chest, as I realized that whatever was in the water was not going to let me leave easily. Suddenly, the boat lurched violently, nearly capsizing as something struck it from below. I clung to the sides, my heart racing as the water began to churn around me. The stillness of the lake was shattered, and I could feel the presence below growing stronger, more insistent. Panic surged through me as I tried to row back to shore, but the boat refused to move. It was as if the lake had claimed me, and there was no escape. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing than before. The mist thickened, enveloping the boat in a suffocating embrace. I could barely see my own hands in front of me, the world around me fading into a featureless void. The water continued to churn, and the boat began to spin slowly, as if being pulled by some unseen force. My thoughts became disjointed, the fear overwhelming all rational thought. As the boat continued its slow, ominous spin, I realized with a sinking heart that I was completely at the mercy of whatever was in the lake. The only thing I could do now was wait and hope that the end would be swift. The boat spun slowly in the water, the mist closing in tighter with each passing moment. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The whispers had returned, louder and more insistent, filling my mind with dread. I gripped the sides of the boat, my knuckles white, as I realized I was completely at the mercy of whatever force was controlling the lake. The water beneath me churned with unseen currents, and I knew that escape was impossible. The boat came to a sudden stop, the silence around me almost deafening. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the water, searching for any sign of movement. The lake was eerily still, the mist hanging over it like a shroud. But I could feel it, the presence below, waiting, watching. I leaned over the edge of the boat, my fear giving way to a desperate need to know what was out there. The water was dark, impenetrable, and as I stared into its depths, I felt a cold, clammy hand grip my heart. Without warning, the boat began to sink, slowly at first, then faster, as if something was pulling it down. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to find something to hold on to, but there was nothing. The water rose around me, cold and unforgiving, soaking through my clothes and chilling me to the bone. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears with their eerie, disjointed voices. I knew I had to get out, but the water was already up to my waist, and the boat continued to sink, dragging me down with it. In a last, desperate attempt to escape, I jumped from the boat, plunging into the icy water. The shock of the cold took my breath away, but I forced myself to swim, to reach the surface. The whispers were all around me now, drowning out everything else. My limbs felt heavy, weighed down by the freezing water, but I kept pushing, kept fighting. The surface seemed impossibly far away, the light from above barely penetrating the murky depths. My lungs burned for air, and just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, I broke through the surface. Gasping for breath, I looked around, disoriented and terrified. The boat was gone, swallowed by the lake, and the shore was nowhere in sight. The mist had thickened, obscuring everything in a dense white fog. The water around me was still, too still, and the whispers had ceased, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. I floated there, alone in the middle of the lake, with no sense of direction or hope of rescue. And as the cold seeped into my bones, I realized that whatever was in the lake had won. I was trapped, doomed to be another lost soul in the haunting of March Lake.